Good evening. Tonight we begin with a story about make-believe adventure and real-life violence, and what some critics fear is a connection between the two in a game.
The idea of the game, which is played by highly imaginative and intelligent kids, is to assume the role of one of the characters.
Yet suicides, murders, and robberies have been linked to this game.
It is also the target of a group of concerned parents in the United States who call themselves B.A.D, B-A.D.D, bothered about Dungeons and Dragons.
Police are also concerned about D&D.
This is as unscientific as you can get. It's nothing but a witch hunt.
Hello Internet, Seth Skorikowski, and today we're going to be taking a deep dive into the RPG moral panic of the 1980s and 90s. Several other channels have tried to cover this topic before, but none of the ones that I've ever found have ever fully covered it, mostly talking about a Tom Hanks movie, while then misidentifying that as being the Satanic Panic, which that was the second of three waves in the RPG moral panic. It's a lot like saying that World War II was about the Allies fighting Germany and then using Pearl Harbor as your main example of that. And the Satanic Panic was just far more and far larger than just RPGs. It was mostly a separate thing. It covered rock music, poisoned Halloween candy, daycare abuse cults, and far, far more, but we will get into that. The point is that they're not telling the whole story, and it is a really interesting story. The RPG moral panic lasted from 1979 until petering out around 2000, 2001-ish. It included several interesting characters, mostly villains, ranging from delusional moral entrepreneurs, fraudsters, and then at least one straight-up sex predator. And it's not only just the history of the role-playing hobby, but a lesson in the traits and the power of a moral panic, which is really important to be able to recognize that, because as Mark Twain is credited but possibly never said, history never repeats itself, but it does often rhyme. So once you study a moral panic and its roots, it becomes much easier to recognize more moral panics in the future. So a couple terms that we need to clarify. The first, of course, being, what the heck is a moral panic? Good question. You're very smart. Coined by sociologist Stanley Cohen in 1972's Folk Devils and Moral Panics, they're when a condition, episode, person, or group of persons emerges to become defined as a threat to societal values and interests. This is then presented in a stylized, stereotypical fashion by the mass media, with moral barricades being manned by editors, bishops, politicians, and other right-thinking people. In less academic speak, a moral panic is when the irrational fear of someone or something evil threatens the interests of society and is deemed as a moral threat. This supposed threat is amplified through mass media rhetoric, touching off existing social anxieties and concerns. These panics are led by what's called moral entrepreneurs, the gatekeepers of morality, media personalities, religious leaders, politicians, and other self-described experts who identify the threat and identify the solutions to it, often through new laws and policies. These claims can become increasingly outlandish, involving conspiracies, as the moral entrepreneurs struggle to maintain the public's fears and interest. Possibly every new form of media that's come out has had some form of moral panic tied to it. Novels, radios, comic books, television, movies, video games, and even the internet. Then criminal panics such as the Switchblade Panic or the Mods and Rockers Panic, political panics such as the Red Scare followed by the Second Red Scare, McCarthyism, or whatever in the hell QAnon was. America has a long history of panics, stretching all the way back to the Salem witch trials, and while yes, we are far from the only country to have them, we are double specialized. That's an AD&D joke. Okay, intros out of the way, let's get started with the RPG moral panic's first wave, 1979 through 1982, Lost in Fantasy. To understand a panic, we first need to look at whatever the societal fears and anxieties of that time were. You know, what tinder allowed this fire to catch? Our story begins in the 1950s with a brand spanking new term called brainwashing. Coined by journalist and CIA operative Edward Hunter, you heard that right, he was a spy, it's a psychological manipulation that causes someone to change their core beliefs and values. This idea was made really popular in the novel and later the film The Manchurian Candidate. By the way, you're about to see a lot of examples of how popular movies have influenced modern panics. In 1971, psychiatrist R.J. Lifton published The Protean Man. In it, he argued that the accelerating pace of history and mass media that's dominating our culture, human behavior no longer had a stable sense of self. Their beliefs, values, and very identity had become unhinged and could shift at a moment's notice. Protean Man ushered in a suspicion that our autonomy as individuals was fragile and subject to manipulation from any number of sources out there. Now, this concept of losing one's identity was then supported in the public's eye by cases such as the Stanford Prison Experiment in 1971, when a role-playing experiment of guards and prisoners got really out of hand with the fake guards abusing the fake prisoners. It was a really poorly run experiment, and things like selection bias and manipulation by the professor to encourage specific results and other factors were likely to blame for what happened. There was also the Stockholm bank robbery of 1973, when after being held captive for 6 days, the 4 hostages defended their captors. And that's of course where we get the term Stockholm Syndrome. Then just 1 year later, in 1974, 19-year-old Patty Hearst, heiress to the Hearst newspaper empire, was kidnapped by the Symbionese Liberation Army, a domestic terrorist organization, and within 2 months hadn't only joined the SLA, but performed a bank robbery and other crimes with them. She tried and failed to use the brainwashing defense at her trial, but being extremely high profile because she was from a super rich media family, so of course this was all over the papers and the public believed her case. Now, I know some commenter out there right now is furiously typing that the concept of Stockholm Syndrome or Patty Hearst Syndrome is questioned. It's not even a recognized diagnosis. Yes, that is true, but in the 1970s, public opinion saw this as unquestioned fact. In 1973, Flora Schreiber published Sybil, a hit book based off the case of Shirley Mason, her name being changed to protect her identity. A woman supposedly possessed with 16 separate personalities, all of which linked to abuse that she had suffered as a child. It was then made into a hit TV movie in 1976 starring the Flying Nun. The Shirley Mason case has largely been debunked as a misdiagnosis and probably implanted suggestions through the hypnotherapy by her psychiatrist, but the idea that trauma might cause one to dissociate from reality and cause a new personality to take over absolutely seized the public imagination, and multiple personalities then became the go-to plot for just about every soap opera for the next 20 years. Apart from this popular idea and fear of brainwashing or dissociative identities that was going on, a second major fear permeated the 1970s, and that was cults. With the social changes of the 1960s brought an intense interest in alternate forms of religion. Some of them were rooted in Eastern philosophies, some were reinterpretations of Christianity, and others were entirely whole cloth and new. Many were led by a guru or some charismatic leader, some of which claiming to be prophets. Now, while many saw these groups as maybe weird but mostly harmless, some of course were very dangerous, such as the Manson family and the high-profile murders that happened from them. And people started wondering, are these religions or are these cults? And the wider public started viewing cults a bit differently, touching off some of the existing fears of mental enslavement and brainwashing that were already prevalent at the time. In 1977, Dr. Eli Shapiro wrote of destructive cultism, a sociopathic illness which is rapidly spreading through the US and the rest of the world in the form of a pandemic. Just 1 year later, in 1978, Jim Jones and his People's Temple led the mass murder and suicides of 918 people, forever cementing Kool-Aid with brainwashed followers, which that is a misnomer. It was actually great flavor aid that they had poisoned. Kool-Aid just got a bum rap out of that whole thing. Which means when my mother-in-law told us that we drunk the Kool-Aid when we got vaccinated a couple years ago, she was wrong on 2 levels. No, Bill Gates wasn't implanting all of us with microchips, and no, it was flavor aid, not Kool-Aid. Evidently, her own research sucked. Anyway, and I promise we're about to get to role-playing games in a minute, but just one final thing. During this period of heightened fears of cults, a new profession was born: cult deprogrammers. The father of cult deprogramming was Ted Black Lightning Patrick, a high school dropout, nightclub owner, and middleweight boxer who forcibly removed his own son from the Children of God cult in 1971. Black Lightning then offered his services to others, and for $2,000 to $5,000, he'd kidnap and deprogram your own loved ones, usually adult children and spouses who had fallen in with cults. And once capturing them, he'd confine them, subject them to sleep deprivation and mental torture to break them of their culty ways. Patrick claimed responsibility for over 2,000 kidnappings carried out for mine reclamation. He was arrested several times for kidnapping and torture. Some of his victims did say that his tactics worked, while others said that they didn't work. Regardless, hero or villain, the badass outlaw hero image that he portrayed resonated with a lot of people, and others started getting into the cult deprogramming biz for themselves. Just call yourself a cult deprogrammer and you are one. It's not like there's a license for it. And like Patrick, most if not all lacked any counseling, psychology, or even medical training. They were just pretty much guys that were charging a lot of money to abduct your loved ones, possibly with violence, and then subject them to their own regimen of abuse in order to cure them. So that's the background. Let's get to the RPG moral panic. The event that kicked it all off was on August 15th, 1979, when 16-year-old James Dallas Egbert III, a computer science major at Michigan State University, went missing. Born of a wealthy family, Egbert was a prodigy. 16 and he was a second-year college student, but he also had a few problems. First, just imagine the loneliness of being 15 or 16 at a university. He's got the tsunami of puberty hormones going on, possibly the most insecure age of your life, and now you're just way younger than everybody else around you. Next, he had incredible pressure from his parents who were pushing him to work harder and harder and just do better and better. He was also epileptic and prone to seizures, and he was coming to terms with his own sexuality as a member of MSU's Gay Council. And maybe as a result of all this, but definitely not helping the situation, is that he had a pretty serious drug habit to boot, including reports that he was cooking his own PCP, which, if you're already prone to seizures and suffer from body image issues or suicidal thoughts, angel dust is like the last drug you should possibly be taking. Egbert left a note that simply read, "To whom it may concern. Should my body be found, I wish it to be cremated." The police began a search. The family put up a $5,000 reward. His uncle, a surgeon living in Irving, Texas, contacted a local detective with an extraordinary reputation, which introduces us to our first villain of our tale, William Deere. Now, this guy is a freaking character, and if you're thinking that I found just the most outlandish picture of him that I could of him cosplaying as Elliot Ness, nope, I took this picture from the back of his book, The Dungeon Master, which is the book that he wrote about the Egbert case. We gotta talk about this dude because he was something. A former Florida highway patrolman, Deere opened up his own private detective agency in 1961. Now, while he did do some notable work, he was also a phenomenal bullshit artist who self-aggrandized and really stole the spotlight no matter what else was going on at the time. He called himself the American James Bond, and you can see that prominently on the cover of his autobiography, where he looks like he's about to accidentally discharge that pistol under his chin. Finger off the trigger there, Billy. There are a lot of stories about this guy. He showed a lot of narcissistic behavior, but to really paint the picture of what I'm talking about, here's a little excerpt from his book, The Dungeon Master. So we're on page 4, and he's just gotten the case to hunt for James Dallas Egbert, and he's assembling his team. This is like that scene in a cool action movie where we get to meet the crew and get a little taste of all their bona fides of being badasses. So this is his chief investigator, Dick Riddle. I swear to God, this dude's name is Dick Riddle. I am not making this up. Anyway, once Dick and I recovered a child from a religious cult that had kidnapped her in Erie, Pennsylvania. We put our helicopter down at an empty schoolyard and got the girl, but then we had to deal with armed cult members. I handed the child to Dick and told him to run for the copter, and I saw the struggles of loyalties on his face. He wanted to stand by my side, but as a good policeman and a member of my agency, he knew that the client's safety came first. So we ran with the child, and I stood there to take a beating. I might have been killed if Dick hadn't forced the frightened helicopter pilot to wait for me. Like, holy shit, that is an amazing story, right? If I had a story like that, that's how I would introduce myself to everybody. We set the copter down at a Pennsylvania schoolyard and rescued this girl from armed cultists, and I handed her Dick and told him to get to the chopper, and I stood there to beat off all the cultists. And then they'd be all, "Sir, this is a Wendy's," and I'd be all like, "Oh yeah, sorry about that, I'll have a number 4. But this story is like a billion times more awesome than the Egbert case. Why isn't the book about a Pennsylvania cult of child kidnappers? Well, unfortunately, no one has ever been able to identify that this story ever happened. Child kidnapping, helicopters landing in Pennsylvania schoolyards, there should be newspaper stories or FBI or police reports, but there is nothing. So it seems that he made the entire thing up just to be able to make everybody look like a bigger badass at the beginning of his book. And notice how he talks about cultists here. He published this book in the early 1980s. We're still at the end of the cult scare at the time, and it hits a lot of that perfect time where if you say cultists and give some wild story, people are going to eat that up without any question at all. It's also a good time to mention that Deere also described himself as a cult deprogrammer, and we just covered what that means, meaning that he was probably the one doing the kidnapping. Anyway, my point is that William Dear was a serial liar, and no lie was too big if he came out of it looking like a badass hero. And any case involving a child prodigy from a rich family was just too good of a detective story to ignore. So Dear and his team roll onto campus on August 29th, and he begins his investigation. The steam tunnels beneath the campus were popular for students to travel building to building whenever it was cold outside. A few of the students did do some sort of fantasy LARP game down there. Now, police, of course, had extensively searched the steam tunnels, but William Dear did it, and he brought a news crew with him. Dear held press conferences, and then they flew over the campus in an airplane to get a bird's eye view, but mostly just to be seen by the press. And then with all of the information about how Egbert had some really serious mental and emotional problems that might have led to him trying to either kill himself or run away, Dear instead focused on Egbert's interest in Dungeons and Dragons, including a corkboard in his dorm room that formed a pattern that looked vaguely like a gun, and Dear was so convinced that this was some sort of special code or clue, he even sent pictures of it to TSR, D&D's publisher, where owners Gary Gygax and Brian Bloom pored over this thing, trying to figure out just what in the hell these pushpins meant. Now, while Egbert did have an interest in Dungeons and Dragons, I mean, it was very popular on campus, there is no evidence or reports that he actually played with anyone on campus. Now, regardless of all that, William Dear proposed a brand new theory, something the police hadn't considered, but only his special expertise and instincts could deduce. Dear theorized that Egbert went down into the steam tunnels to play a new and more immersive kind of D&D, and he never returned. That Egbert had suffered a mental break and was lost in the fantasy. Essentially, he had brainwashed himself and was taking on the personality of his character. Yes, it's preposterous, and he had zero evidence to support any of this, but Dear told this story to the press, and the press ate it up. A brilliant, that emotionally fragile young man becoming brainwashed and dissociating from reality because of some weird fantasy game that he was playing. They couldn't get enough of this. And the public found Dear's story of the vulnerable child genius becoming victim to his own fantasy compelling because it slotted perfectly into those existing cultural fears and pop psychology of the 1970s. Even more so because Dear's portrayal of Egbert throughout his book would flip between the innocent victim lost in fantasy to the manipulative dungeon master who had orchestrated this maddening web that Dear and his men were now caught in, meaning that it hit both notes of the victim and the tormenting villain, aka the dungeon master. Well, it turns out Dear was hilariously wrong. In truth, Egbert had gone down the steam tunnels to kill himself by overdosing on a bottle of Quaaludes, but he woke up and survived and ran away. He ended up down in New Orleans with some people, and after a second failed attempt to kill himself with poison, he decided to call the authorities and turn himself in. Dear went down to pick him up on September 13th. Sadly, James Dallas Egbert eventually did take his own life with a handgun 1 year later. While Dear did later admit that the incident didn't have anything to do with Dungeons & Dragons, the public was already captured in the story, and the release of Polish-Swiss psychologist Alice Miller's internationally best-selling The Drama of the Gifted Child in 1979 seemed to support and give credibility to Dear's narrative of the gifted yet emotionally fragile gamer. It's really important to note that Dear never touted Dungeons & Dragons as promoting violence or amoral behavior, only D&D's ability to absorb people into the fantasy. 1981 saw the release of two novels inspired by the Egbert case. Hobgoblin, written by John Coyne, was about a teenager who'd become obsessed with a fantasy role-playing game called Hobgoblin, and he loses touch with reality. Mazes and Monsters by Rona Jaffe was closer to the Egbert case, following a group of 4 college students all suffering some form of emotional trauma, and they have the love of playing mazes and monsters, playing characters who represent idealized versions of themselves as a way of coping with whatever their personal trauma is. Now, while playing in some caves, the character Robbie suffers a psychotic episode, loses himself into the role of his character. Now, eventually, the 3 friends track Robbie down to New York, and in the end, the 3 friends have learned to all overcome their traumas and no longer need to play the game, while Robbie, unfortunately, is forever lost to his delusion. Real bummer of an ending. In 1982, it was turned into a CBS made-for-TV movie starring a very young Tom Hanks, and fun fact, I'm on the commentary track for the 40th anniversary Blu-ray release, so I got that going for me. Mazes and Monsters cemented the delusional gamer narrative in the public's mind, and concerns about fantasy role-playing games skyrocketed after this movie came out. A lot of people equate Mazes and Monsters to the Satanic Panic, which is untrue. It's a telltale that they haven't actually researched this subject too deeply. There are no supernatural elements outside of the monsters that are inside Robbie's delusions. It doesn't support the later narrative narrative that RPGs promoted violence or amoral behavior. Instead, Robbie is emulating his priest character. He's abstaining from drinking and drugs. He breaks up with his girlfriend because he's abstaining from sex. He's a pacifist and morally uptight. All of this was just based off of pop psychology and includes zero information about the devil, magic, or cults. It's ultimately about the dangers of hiding from your problems through games instead of just facing your problems and growing up. This is the core narrative of the RPG Moral Panic's first wave. Now, the Satanic Panic, which is the second wave, that is when things go truly bonkers. Now, parents would see their children become obsessed with D&D, like how kids do when they're discovering a new hobby, and they were equating to this to how people become obsessed when they're discovering a new religion, and they're beginning to see their behaviors being cult-like instead of normal. The Dungeon Master position fell neatly into that role of being a cult leader who had the power over the player characters and could order them on quests and punish those that they seemed unworthy. And this power and inevitable abuse by a game master, as the players being the submissive victims to them, it really reminded them of the Stanford prison experiment, and that kind of solidified their views, right? It confirmed what they were worried about Dungeons and Dragons. Moral entrepreneurs then love making up their own facts to throw on top of this fire as well. In The Truth About Dungeons and Dragons, author Joan Hake Robbie writes in the very opening and in bold letters, psychologists have claimed time and time again that when someone lives in the realm of fantasy for an extended length of time, the lines dividing reality and fantasy become distorted, fuzzy. Instead, studies have shown that playing make-believe actually helps children differentiate fantasy from reality, but what are facts when we got a moral fight on our hands, right? Moral entrepreneurs feel that their claims are true, and they feel that they're in the right. So therefore, making up studies to, kind of support their claims feels totally justified in their eyes. Now, one psychologist, Dr. Joyce Brothers, promoted role-playing games as a useful exercise, contributing to the intellectual and emotional development and creativity in young players. Here she is in 1980 on TV talking about TSR's Fantasy Forest children's game. TSR ended up hiring her as a consultant and spokesperson in 1982 through 1984 in order to combat the larger claims that were going against them for the moral panic. It's also worth noting that the argument how gamers will not be able to differentiate fantasy from reality is a very old, tried and true recycled tactic. The worry of women reading these brand spanking new fangled novels in the 1700s was their fragile girl brains would lose contact with reality, so once again, history rhymes. Now, maybe if the gifted but delusional gamer narrative had just been the extent of the panic, rational voices may have prevailed. However, a second and much larger storm had been brewing like a Cat 5 hurricane, and once it hits the scene, all rationality goes right out the window. The big thing to understand here is that we are looking at a separate but simultaneous moral panic. The Satanic Panic would have happened whether Dungeons and Dragons existed or not. And then once the panics merged like the perfect storm, RPGs were really just a small blip, a footnote in the larger Satanic Panic. But to the RPG moral panic, the Satanic Panic hit and surged them like a tsunami of madness. Picture the two panics like this. You have twin brothers. Now the first one, he's a bully and a dick, and he makes a lot of claims that sound plausible, but are really just a bunch of paranoid bullshit. But he's small. You could probably take this guy in a fight. Then you got the second brother, who is exactly like this one. However, he's also been in the basement the past couple years, lifting weights and chugging cough syrup and hallucinating the shadow people coming out of the walls. And when the Satanic Panic bursts out of the basement, the two of them merge together like a whacked out master blaster. Okay, because the Satanic Panic was a different moral panic, we once again need to go back to before and figure out just where in the hell this came from. Now, as I mentioned, the two panics are close relatives. Sociologist David Bromley identified the Satanic Panic as the successor to the 1970s cult scare in his 1991 article, Satanism, the New Cult Scare. So we don't need to cover that aspect again, but instead focus on how it diverged. According to Philip Jenkins, the idea of modern satanic cults, especially in the upper echelons of society, was popularized in the pulps of the 1930s, most notable being Dennis Wheatley's The Devil Rides Out, a novel that I love and have referenced multiple times on this channel. It absolutely blew my mind when I found that this novel was named as Patient Zero. I suppose I shouldn't be thrilled by that, but I was because, that's how fandoms work. Anyway, Hammer Films made a movie version in 1968, the same year as Rosemary's Baby, which featured a cult of Satanists operating in an upscale New York apartment building. Then there was The Omen, featuring the Antichrist child being assisted by Satanists operating within the Catholic Church. The Exorcist, which doesn't feature cults, but did involve the power of evil operating through a Ouija board. And of course, these were just the big hits. There were a lot more and a lot less popular and lower budget movies depicting demons, devils, and satanic cults. 1972 introduced us to a new villain in our tale, Mike Warnke, when he published his autobiography, The Satan Seller. In it, he recounted his time of being introduced to Satanism, working his way up to be a high priest, presiding over 1,500 Satanists in California. He oversaw satanic rituals, magic spells, demon summonings, ritual orgies, kidnappings, and rapes. Then in Vietnam, he found Jesus and gave himself to Christ. The book was a bestseller. It was also total bullshit. But through the 70s and 80s, Warnke was considered a leading authority on Satanism and satanic cults, and he made quite a profitable career, selling millions of books and albums and touring sold-out venues. His lies grew more and more elaborate, and they began contradicting one another. Then by 1992, his lies had just become impossible to ignore. The Christian magazine Cornerstone thoroughly debunked his story as being a Satanist and exposed him as being a total fraud. But his 20 years of lies had done a lot of damage and remained part of the public folklore, just simply too ingrained at that point and taking on a life of their own. For example, in his book Schemes of Satan, Warnke said that before killing himself, James Dallas Egbert wrote, "I'll give Satan my mind and power," which is completely untrue. Later, in Joan Robbie's The Truth About Dungeons & Dragons, the lie is repeated. So even though Warnke was exposed as a fraud, his lies continued on like a game of telephone, the details just shifting and nobody really knowing where it originated from. Thanks to Warnke's lies, the fear of satanic cults went from movies to real life, and people could not get enough of this idea. This touches on what Professor Jason Bivens refers to as the erotics of fear, which is the fascination people have with the sensational and lurid details, eliciting thrills from drama and outrage. These details are dangerous, horrifying, and completely alluring. This is why true crime and cult documentaries are just so addictive. Moral entrepreneurs gain their own pleasure from this. In some ways, they're the most addicted to the erotics of fear, escalating their claims and exaggerating minor incidents or making up entirely new and elaborate conspiracies to not only feed an insatiable public, but to feed their own pleasure and egos as being the defenders against these depravities. They cast themselves as being, part detective and part warrior, who alone can uproot the sinister forces threatening America. Essentially, the more depraved and horrible that they cast their opponent, the more righteous that they look and they feel. 1979 saw the release of Jay's Journal, a book edited by Beatrice Sparks, because while it claimed to be a true story and was very loosely based on the diary of a 16-year-old boy named Alden Barrett who had killed himself in 1971, this book, written in a diary format, follows the brilliant 16-year-old Jay as he starts doing drugs, gets involved with a satanic group with a very persuasive leader. He learns the occult and magic. He performs animal murders and mutilations. He becomes possessed by a demon named Raoul, and eventually he takes his own life. Again, this was presented as a true story with all of the names changed. Many of the animal mutilation urban legends that happened during the Satanic Panic were directly inspired by this book. It also helped solidify the brilliant, yet emotionally vulnerable victim narrative, because Jay wanted to approach the occult from a scientific angle, but ultimately he was caught up in the powers of evil. It's possible that this book is what inspired William Deere's claims during the Egbert case. Now, Barrett's real family was really upset because this book completely misrepresented him and barely used any of his actual diary that was supposed to be in the novel. But of course that didn't matter. The book was a hit, and in large part to being touted as a totally true and real story, which held people believe it despite the fact that the stuff inside of it was preposterous. Then in 1980, the bomb dropped with Michelle Remembers. Written by Michelle Smith and her therapist, later husband, Lawrence Pansder, presented as a factual and completely true story. You might have noticed a trend here with totally true bullcrap stories. Michelle Remembers chronicles therapy sessions where, through recovered memory therapy, a now discredited form of psychotherapy, Michelle recalls memories from being 5 years old and abused by a satanic cult. While under hypnosis, Michelle Michelle gives all the lurid details of this extensive and international satanic cult that her family belonged to. And during these rituals, how she was tortured, locked in cages, sexually assaulted, witnessed several human sacrifice, and then was rubbed with the blood and body parts of various sacrificed infants and adults. And then, during an 81-day ritual in 1955, they summoned Satan himself. The book exploded in popularity and sold millions of copies. It inspired so many things that became staples of the Satanic Panic. Hypnosis recovered memories, satanic ritual abuse, or SRAs as they're called, and plausibly huge cults with murdering Satanists operating within respectable cities, and not just cults, but a full-blown international conspiracy of Satanists. The public ate this story up. Michelle and her husband went on a talk show sharing their story of murder and secret societies. Few of these talk shows even questioned it, merely let her share her incredible story. Now, of course, her story is complete and total bullshit. In the last 45 years, none of it has ever been confirmed, and a whole lot of evidence has been found that points to the fact that it didn't happen at all. But in 1980, the erotics of fear, the thrill of hearing all the grotesque and horrible details, a lot of people bought this story. And that's why Michelle Remembers is considered the final spark that ignited the Satanic Panic. Desperate to give the people what they want, shows like Oprah and Geraldo took on satanic cults. They weren't about journalism, they were about content. And the more TV shows and trusted faces that talked about satanic cults, the more people believed in them. The panic itself was huge. It consumed the public imagination. It also absorbed other panics as well. Popular music, which has had several panics over the decades, from jazz to the Beatles, it now focused on heavy metal and Kiss, which everybody at the time knew Kiss stood for Knights in Satan's Service. And claims are made how playing songs backwards revealed hidden satanic messages and also destroy your records. We had claims about Halloween candy was poisoned or laced with needles or razor blades, and I clearly remember hospitals offering to x-ray all your Halloween candy when I was a kid. One of my favorite conspiracies that came out of this whole panic was the company Procter & Gamble, which was over 140 years old, but they were accused of being ruled by a satanic cabal, because if you look at their logo, there were 13 stars, devil horns, and some swirls that if you flipped it upside down and squinted your eyes looked a lot like a 666. Oddly, Procter & Gamble were the sole sponsors of Mazes and Monsters TV movie, which is kind of a weird move for accused satanic cult to sponsor the only anti-D&D movie that was out at the time. And of course, there were hundreds upon hundreds of cases of hypnotherapy discovering suppressed memories of satanic ritual abuse, the most notable being the McMartin preschool case. Okay, enough about this. My point is that RPGs were barely a blip to the larger satanic panic. I mean, they had massive companies in the music industries and daycare sex cults of, pedophiles on their sites, but role-playing games did get a little bit of attention from them. The first notable incident was in April of 1980, just 6 months after the Egbert case. A Utah school district shut down a D&D program, not because people were getting lost in the fantasy, but because the game contained occult symbols and terminology just like witchcraft books. Parents feared that these demonic elements would leave their children open to satanic spirits. Now, during the multiple attempts to end this program, those who defended D&D were accused of witchcraft, which is why they stopped defending D&D, because we're having an actual witch hunt on our hands, and witch hunts are an American tradition. Over the next few years, there were scattered cases and other articles. The emerging narrative of occult dangers was a contrast to the previous narrative of the innocent gamer losing touch with reality. We now had a sinister motive. With all the other stuff going on in the panic, D&D probably wouldn't have garnered much mainstream media attention. That was until Bink Pulling. On June 9, 1982, 16-year-old Irving Bink Pulling ended his life by shooting himself in the chest. A student at his school's gifted and talented program, there had been signs that something was wrong. Several pet rabbits and a cat had been killed and mutilated over the month before this, and there were some rumors of marital problems with his parents, but when police arrived and they questioned Bink's shocked parents, one officer asked if he'd been a devil worshiper and produced some D&D books from Bink's room, introducing the Pullings to the Satanic Panic. Grief makes us do some very strange things, and in the wake of a senseless death, people want to find something to blame, a villain. So when that officer suggested Dungeons & Dragons, Bink's grieving mother latched onto that single idea, introducing our next villain, Patricia Pulling. After finding a note that his dungeon master had given him about being cursed with lycanthropy, Patricia decided that her son's mental anguish about his character led to his suicide. And then, depending on the audience that she was talking to, sometimes she said that it was a real curse that had been placed upon him. Patricia blamed D&D for her son's death, and she would stop at nothing to destroy D&D. So she used every narrative that she could, from the purely psychological children being lost in fantasy, or also that it garnered interest in dangerous cults. Even if the person she was talking to didn't believe in cults or Satan, but the children believed in it, and the actions that they took as a result were real. Or if her audience did believe in Satan and magic, she would argue that the game directly led to satanic corruption. Now, I don't know if she believed all of this stuff or not. I just think that she believed whatever argument would work in order to achieve her goal. After trying and failing to sue the school's principal for Bink's death and a failed lawsuit against game publisher TSR, she founded B.A.D., Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons, as the face of the D&D threat, with a highly organized group, including other grieving parents that came to B.A.D. to find solace in the loss of their children. Pulling made a huge group. She did interviews, speaking engagements, going on over 200 radio and television shows, including 60 Minutes, Larry King Live, Geraldo, The Oprah Winfrey Show, Sally Jesse Raphael, The 700 Club, and more. She reinvented herself as an occult crime investigator and consultant. Virginia State Records said that she received her private investigator license in October of 1987, but in radio interviews that she gave shortly after that, she said that she'd actually been an investigator for the 6 years prior. And then her own obituary listed that she'd been an investigator since 1984, so the dates, according to her, kept shifting because the longer she'd been an investigator, the more legitimate that she seemed. In her book, The Devil's Web, which is an honestly amazing cover. I absolutely love this cover. That little girl looks so freaking creepy. Just wow. She included photographs of her visiting the ranch of a Mexican cartel boss and cult leader, Adolfo Costanzo, after police had raided it. Costanzo practiced an eclectic mix of religions that he believed would give him power, and the police found several murder victims who'd been sacrificed. Now, while he wasn't a Satanist, police described the scene as satanic, which you can't blame him. If you find a bunch of people that have been sacrificed in like a shed somewhere, you're going to be like, holy crap, this is satanic, right? Pulling's photos are captioned as Investigator Pat Pulling as she points to an Aganga cross, making it look like she was there in some official capacity, called in by police as an occult expert. Truth is that she wasn't. She was just there, and she took some photos of her pointing at stuff. She was a crime scene tourist hoping to get a little bit of clout by making it look like she had been involved in a very high-profile case. Pulling spoke at different conferences for occult crimes. Various law enforcement officers, they would attend these things. Most they had a personal interest, or maybe as part of a continuing education program. Pulling would then list on her resume as having consulted all of those various departments, police, sheriff's departments, the FBI, as an occult crimes expert, as if she was being called in to work cases with all of these departments and not just somebody who had been presenting at a conference that just somebody from that police department had come to one day. She was making it look like she was being called in and specially training them. B.A.D. made special packets for law enforcement to identify D&D crimes and suicides. It included questions that you should ask suspects that were involved with D&D, such as the alignment and level of their character, their dungeon master's real identity, because they would try to hide that from you, and if they had read the Necronomicon. The made-up fantasy book, the Necronomicon? Yeah. B.A.D. focused a lot on linking D&D to suicides and murders, even on the most tenuous of relations. Press and law enforcement seemed happy to go along with this, branding D&D the root of any crime, even ignoring other evidence. If there was a player's handbook anywhere nearby, D&D was just given the blame, case closed. An example is in 1986, two boys were playing with a shotgun in a bedroom, and 16-year-old David Ventaquattro shot and killed his 11-year-old friend. It was a tragic accident, but police found some D&D books and figured out that the boys had been playing, and they came up with their own story. And then, after isolating and grilling him alone for 8 hours, got Ventaquattro to confess that he had shot his friend as part of this game because his friend had become evil and his character's mission was to extinguish evil. Ventaquattro was convicted of murder. The appellate court later overturned it because the forced confession was inadmissible. Now, oddly, the New York Times ran 2 articles about the conviction, but I couldn't find anything on the forced confession and overturning. Weird. Now, most of these cases, the biggest culprit, of course, was that children were given unsupervised access to firearms, but yeah, that's a bit of a touchy subject, so let's just blame fantasy RPGs instead. But the press loved talking about D&D, the scary fantasy game that made you kill and damned your soul, and adding a D&D angle made any story far more exciting, such as the mysterious death of Kurt McFall. Maybe it was an accident, maybe it was a hate crime, but Robert Stack made damn sure to throw suspicion on D&D and a possible D&D cult as the likely cause. Now, one detail that Pulling added to her list of notable D&D suicides, which the last two were brothers and their parents have argued that it wasn't related to D&D at all, despite what the press kept insisting, but that is a completely different story. Pulling pointed out that half of these suicides were on a full moon, and that is just too wild to be a coincidence, right? I mean, this has to be occult related. I mean, what are the chances that half of them were taking place on a full moon? One clever person on the Escapist website checked, and it turns out that not a single one of them was on the full moon. This is a prime example of how moral entrepreneurs work, making up evidence to support their claims faster than anyone can reach a counter argument against them. They say like, oh, did you know half of the suicides take place on the full moon? You're like, no, I hadn't heard that. And they're like, aha, that shows that you don't know what you're talking about. Now, these days, we can pull up a multi-year lunar phase calendar on our phone, but not back then. And moral entrepreneurs don't see this as deception. It's just something that feels true, which once again to them is just as valid as real facts. Speaking of facts, I did check these numbers, and this one should be May 18th, not May 19th. Still not a full moon, but I am trying to be accurate in this video. Pulling also declared that D&D was a religion, her argument being that the separation of church and state should require that schools ban it. Other claims makers use this to brand D&D clubs as being state-sponsored witchcraft. At one point, Pulling claimed that 8% of the population of the Richmond, Virginia were Satanists. When a reporter pointed out that would be 56,000 Satanists, even more than there were Methodists, and asked how Pulling had come up with this number, Pulling gave some convoluted way that she'd calculated it, and she'd concluded that 4% of adults and 4% of children were occultists, and 4 plus 4 equals 8%, which is not how percentages work, Patricia. If you'd played RuneQuest, you'd know that. Wanting to boost her bullshit up to the next level, Pulling teamed up with another RPG villain, Dr. Thomas Radecki, a psychiatrist, founding member of the National Coalition on Television Violence, and current convict, but we will get to that in a little bit. This dude was something else. It's almost commendable about how much he sucked. At one point, he claimed that 1 in 8 Hollywood films contained a rape scene. Now, Radecki was not interested in D&D being occult or satanic, but he was convinced that it promoted violence. And by violence, I mean eating babies, drinking blood, rape, murder, and curses of insanity, which is like 1 billion times more hardcore than any game that I've ever played in. He once quoted Mazes and Monsters as proof of this. I mean, apart from Mazes and Monsters being a work of fiction and not proof of anything, it is a totally different RPG game than Dungeons and Dragons. I mean, the two games aren't even compatible. Radecki and Pulling did a lot of work together. They petitioned to have warning labels placed on game books and the cartoon about the deaths that were linked to D&D. Strangely, the FTC and FCC found claims of gradual dissociation and demonic possession just a little difficult to quantify for warning label purposes. Because they claimed that D&D as the root to violent crime, many criminals attempted the D&D offense. Essentially, D&D made them do it. And Pulling and Radecki were frequently called in as expert witnesses on behalf of criminals. A college kid murders his parents because they threatened to cut him off. D&D made him do it. A guy knocks over a liquor store and shoots the clerk. D&D made him do it. Now, while parents groups and cult cops might believe these claims of dissociation from reality and desensitization of violence from D&D, and that how these people were not responsible for their actions, judges and jurors didn't buy this, and the D&D defense never worked. Okay, there was one time that the D&D defense kinda sorta worked. In Orangeville, Ontario, a teen strangled 2 children. It was horrific and senseless. The teen, who was guilty as hell, used the D&D defense. Radecki even came and spoke at the trial. Now, because this guy was a minor, Canada law said that the most he could get was 3 years. However, if the courts agreed that this teen was insane due to D&D, he could be locked away indefinitely. So that's what they did. Meaning that with the D&D defense, even if you win, you still lose. In 1992, it was discovered that Radecki was having sex with his patients, which is frowned upon, and his license was revoked. A few years later, he was given his license back, which was a huge mistake because he was then caught running a pill mill and trading prescription opioids for sex. He's currently in prison, and maybe he should have tried that D&D Defense himself. For most of the 80s, RPG fans were taking on this fight individually one at a time, desperately trying to refute shotgun blasts of accusations and ridiculous claims. But in 1987, CARPGA formed, an organization set to refute the moral entrepreneurs. They assembled counter-arguments against accusations, and it also researched and distributed information that discredited many of the lies that the moral entrepreneurs have been repeating over and over again as if they were indisputable fact. CARPGA was exceptionally effective at quelling a lot of these accusations. And while many game designers such as Gary Gygax and Greg Stafford did speak out against B.A.D. and the religious right's outlandish accusations against them, they were mostly silent and keeping their heads low during this time. Gygax, he had to hire a bodyguard at one point due to all the death threats that he was receiving. He was receiving a lot of heat as is. He didn't want to put a bigger target on himself. However, one man rose above them all, a hero named Michael Stackpole. Coming from Flying Buffalo Games, Stackpole began addressing the media misinformation in 1982. Instead of refuting Patricia Pulling's already exaggerated statistics for gamer suicides, he compared it to the national average of teen suicides to show that gamers were less likely to commit suicide. Games give them self-confidence, build social groups, and he turned her own numbers into an argument for tabletop role-playing games. And then in 1980, Stackpole released the Pulling Report, a comprehensive breakdown refuting every argument Pulling had made and exposing the exaggerated and fraudulent claims that she'd made about herself. It was educated, extensively thorough, and utterly devastating. You can find a copy of it on Stackpole's website. Properly humiliated, Pulling stepped down from the head of B.A.D. and the organization was effectively dead. Let that be a lesson to never ever fuck with Mike Stackpole. The man takes no prisoners. Meanwhile, the religious anti-satanic D&D movement had been carrying on this entire time, and, well...
Games like Dungeons & Dragons incorporate actual occult practices into the body of the game.
Dungeons & Dragons is the most effectively, most magnificently packaged, most profitably marketed, the most thoroughly researched introduction to the occult in man's recorded histories.
Believe it or not, you can learn spells right out of Dungeons & Dragons.
There's sixes involved in the pieces of the game, but they take the pieces of the game, they would throw them in the incinerator or the fireplace, and screams would come out because there seemed to be some kind of spiritual forces inhabiting those pieces.
Yeah, they claim that the pieces screamed when you burned them. It is impossible to list all of the kooky claims that they made about Dungeons & Dragons being satanic. Pretty much every sentence in the books was used to affirm their claims that D&D was literally of the devil. Stats, you roll 3d6, 3 6s, that's 666. Dungeon masters were portrayed as half-demon cult leaders who tormented, extorted them for money, or even turned them into literal servants, buying groceries and cleaning their houses for them. And you know what? I hope that last one is true, because good on her if it is. That is the dungeon master dream right there. Other claims are just made up whole cloth, like once you reach the highest level, you are the master, and the only way out is death. D&D spells were all sorts of problems. If the rules said that the caster had to speak it or use a component like a goldfish or a pinch of sulfur, they interpreted it as the player learning actual magic instead of just being flavor text or resource management, like, hey, if you don't have your goldfish written on your character sheet, you can't cast that spell. Pre-spells like Sticks to Snakes, Cure Blindness, and Animal Summoning were considered heretical because those were miracles out of the Bible, and they saw that any player characters performing those same spells were trying to show that the miracles in the Bible were not miraculous. Demon and devil names from the Bible or Paradise Lost that appeared in D&D, which were seen as proof that they were to be worshipped in the game and not be killed for, experience and gold, and that the only way that D&D's creators would even know those names was absolute proof that they were occultists. Now, one thing to know about co-creators Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, both of them were devout Christians and very well-read men. Of course, they'd read the Bible and Milton and all the exact same books that the moral entrepreneurs entrepreneurs had read. They wrote what they knew and what all their interests were, so of course they put Asmodeus and Moloch into the game books, the same way that their reading of Tolkien is why we had treants and hobbits originally in D&D. The fact that you could buy holy water and wolfsbane, belladonna, and other herbs showed that it was occultic. But the reason that those were even in the books in the first place is because the authors watched horror movies like Wolfman and Dracula. The same movies that the claim makers watched in order to even learn that they were occultic in the first place. At least according to Hollywood that they were occultic. I don't really know if they are, but instead of the claims makers going like, oh my God, you guys like the same movies we do, we should hopefully hang out. They were like, no, the fact that you know this thing that I know because we both watch the same movies means that you worship the devil. Movies played a huge role in D&D. Clerics turning undead came straight from Hammer horror movies. The monk character class was from watching kung fu movies, yet these were all things that were specifically listed as proof of Satanism. Joseph Laycock points out in Dangerous Games that what made the RPG Moral Panic interesting is the accusers claim that the players will be lost in fantasy, yet these are the same people who are role-playing themselves as occult crime detectives, exorcists, and cult deprogrammers, hoisting up their own egos as they imagine themselves as warriors in some holy campaign. The anti-role players were the ones who were disassociating from reality, and the difference between the two is that the gamers confined all of their heroic fantasies to the game table, while the moral entrepreneurs didn't. They were just doing a non-consensual LARP. Now, while Patricia Pulling did specifically have it out for Dungeons & Dragons, other games fell victim to the panic as well. Tunnels and Trolls, Chivalry and Sorcery, and other fantasy role-playing games, which I'm going to note, why in the hell do we not use the term FRP or FRPG anymore? Gamers, we need to take FRP back. We need to use that again. In 1984, a Christian role-playing game hit the scene called Dragon Raid, and it was a fantasy Bible learning RPG where the players need to demonstrate evangelical values through their character in order to overcome obstacles. Players needed to memorize what's called word runes, which were like spells, but they were Bible scriptures, making this the first FRPG where the players had to memorize and recite an in-game spell at the table. Now, surely the anti-RPG fundamentalists would approve of this game, right? Where everyone is of good alignment and promotes Christian values and teaches scripture. Nope, they hated it, and gamers hated it too. The one thing that unified both sides was that everyone hated Dragon Raid. It really is beautiful when everyone can come together for a single cause. Okay, and what RPG Moral Panic story would be complete without Jack Chick's infamous tract Dark Dungeons? Published in 1984, Dark Dungeons follows Debbie and Marcy under their game master, Miss Frost. Debbie learns actual spells, which she uses to cast a mind bondage spell on her father to buy her $200 in new D&D materials, which is like $600 in 2025 money. Nice. Tragically, Marcy hangs herself because her character died. Distraught, Debbie goes to a meeting from a creepy-looking reformed witch who exorcises the D&D demons from her body, and then Debbie burns all those sweet D&D books that her dad had just bought her when she still had enough time to have returned them. Dark Dungeons is legendary among gamers for just being peak ridiculous. Now, evidently, and I had not heard this story before, some conventions used to pass out copies of Dark Dungeons with all the word bubbles blanked out and just have a contest to see who could write the funniest dialogue. I mean, that really needs to come back. My first experience with this type of gag was in 2001. There was a version that circulated online where it follows a pair of gamers who are converting from 2nd edition AD&D to 3rd edition D&D, but one hanged herself because she didn't want to buy all new books, and eventually Debbie called out Gygax's name and burned all of her 3E books. And over the past few years, I've been known to drop my own recaption panels on my social media from time to time, but I really want some con to bring this back, the Rewrite Dark Dungeons contest. I think that would be an absolute hoot. In 2014, they made a movie of it, and it is amazing. It's a comedy, but what makes it hilarious is they played it absolutely straight, leaning into the already over-the-top absurdity. Seriously, if you have never seen it, do yourself a favor and watch this movie. It is brilliant, and it should be played at Gen Con like some sort of, Rocky Horror Picture Show for gamers. Now, speaking of movies, we did get a few D&D movies from the Panic, telling the story of these evil role-playing games. 1983 Skullduggery, where a player is cursed by the devil and becomes a serial killer. It is pretty awful and not even fun for yuck factor. And then 1984's The Dungeon Master, which is just weird as shit. I mean, it's at least worth watching, but not watching with sober eyes. After Chris Pritchard and his friends murdered his stepfather in order to get the inheritance, they tried and failed to use the D&D Defense. The murder was the subject of 2 novels, both wildly exaggerating D&D's role in the crime and making up all sorts of stuff that's not actually inside the game. In 1992, they were both turned into made-for-TV movies, Honor Thy Mother, which I haven't seen, and Cruel Doubt, which I was forced to watch at 14. You know, a lot of gamers out there refer to Mazes and Monsters as the D&D Panic movie that their parents forced them to watch when they were kids, but this one was mine. Starring a young and unknown Gwyneth Paltrow before she grew up to peddle overpriced New Age vagina eggs, and I will never forget the scene where Adam, I coined the term Gamergate Baldwin's character, reads from the player's handbook, and it is a bunch of crap that's not even in the player's handbook. They just made it all up for the movie. Young me was enraged at the blatant lies, and old me is still a little salty about all that. You can find the movie on YouTube, and I should probably watch it again sometime with some friends and some booze, but it might still be too soon. By the early 90s, the Satanic Panic was winding to a close. Mike Warnke had been exposed as a fraud, and people had started noticing how outlandish the claims had gotten and just kind of lost interest in the whole thing. Police departments who'd spent a fortune on occult crime specialists who really hadn't investigated anything more than spray-painted pentagrams from Motley Crue fans, they just cut their losses and moved on to less imaginary crimes. In 1990, the wildly publicized McMartin preschool case where hundreds of children were supposedly subject to satanic ritual abuse ended after 7 years and $15 million because there were no hidden basements under the building or any evidence of these allegations whatsoever. In 1994, after the Satanic Panic was done, the National Center on Child Abuse and Neglect reported that out of the 12,000 accusations of satanic ritual abuse, not one turned out to be true. A lot of lives were ruined for ridiculous bullshit. And like with many moral panics, people kind of forgot that how they had gotten swept up in the whole hysteria themselves and just kind of blamed it on other people that believed all that stuff. But there was no time to reflect on the fears of satanic cults because a new moral panic was on the horizon. And as before, the RPG moral panic hopped on its back for one final ride. Unlike the first 2 waves where we can point to a specific incident and date that started this whole thing, the third was more of a gradual progress before peaking in 97 and then petering out around 99 or 2000. Now, as before, let's look at the pulse of what society was worried about at this time. Youth crime, robberies, assaults, and murders had been steadily increasing since the 1960s. In the mid-1980s, it began shooting up, and by 1990, arrests for juvenile crime were 2 to 3 times what they were 30 years before. By 1995, it skyrocketed to 3 to 5 times that. Now, youth crime was dominating the news, with fears of roaming gangs of street punks. In 1993, Senator Joe Biden gave an impassioned speech how we needed to get these predators off our streets. In 1995, John DiLulio coined the term super predators for an article in the Weekly Standard, and then expanded in his book Body Count. Super predators are radically impulsive, brutally remorseless youngsters, including ever more pre-teenage boys who will murder, assault, rape, rob, burglarize, deal deadly drugs, join gun-toting gangs, and create serious communal disorders. In addition, they do not fear the stigma of arrest, the pains of imprisonment, or the pangs of conscience. Holy shit, this sounds like the description for the fucking Terminator right here. Between that and the fact that they're called predators, I'm guessing DiLulio was an Arnold Schwarzenegger fan. Now, the press ate this up. The imminent super predator threat was a topic in the '96 presidential election. Neither side of the aisle were denying that they existed, but they were really debating on who was going to deal the harshest justice and keep us safe from these unstoppable murder kids. It's an interesting transition from the 1970s, where we had the gifted but emotionally fragile gamer who was drawn into the fantasy and they were just victims themselves. Now, these kids are just born evil. They can't be cured and they are coming for you. Spoiler, super predators are not real. Youth crime rates had already begun dropping and continued dropping to today to their 1960s numbers. It was a lot of bad analytics and thinly veiled racism, and even DeLulio admits that he was completely wrong. Now, as for why youth crime rates dropped, that is a debated subject. There are some very plausible theories out there, but this isn't the topic of the video. But experts all agree that it had nothing to do with the harsh laws that the super predator scare produced. But at the time, we have to remember that America was terrified of its kids. One group that gained a lot of concern during all this was the growing goth subculture. It had been growing since the 70s, but really hit major popularity in the 90s, with more and more metal and industrial bands and Hollywood movies leaning into those gothic themes. Goth culture really captured Gen X's pessimism of the time, and moral entrepreneurs were deeply concerned with goths' use of, black leather, trench coats, macabre imagery, including vampires and witches, and occultic symbols like ankhs and pinnacles. Another area of concern was hacking. The internet was a new and strange thing for most Americans, but computers are becoming more and more part of our lives, and with that came new fears and new laws against this new type of crime. This, of course, appeared in the movies. 1995 introduced us to the beauty and charm of Matthew Lillard and the weirdness that is Angelina Jolie, though at the time we thought it was the other way around. And also Keanu Reeves teaming up with Ice-T and a dolphin in order to hack his own brain. And if you're not familiar with Johnny Mnemonic, that last sentence might have sounded like I was having a stroke. Anyway, the point of all of this is that goths and hacking and merciless gun-toting youths and the fear of them was all part of that 1990s zeitgeist. Meanwhile, role-playing culture had changed as well. Through the 70s and early 80s, most RPGs were fantasy, with heroes battling monsters in a medievalish setting, and that's primarily what the Moral Panic had focused on. There were other genres, of course. Traveler and other sci-fi games were popular, especially in the wake of Star Wars. Horror games set in the 20th century, most notably 1981's Call of Cthulhu, which had somehow avoided the Satanic Panic's attention this whole time, despite it literally being about your neighbor being a baby-eating cultist. Those games did exist, but more and more gamers were looking for something, a bit more grounded in the present day or the near future. Not castles, but city streets, where characters weren't heroes that were trying, to save the world, but people trying to survive against a government or corporate conspiracy, both human and supernatural, and the stakes weren't amounting, about getting large amounts of gold, but keeping your own humanity or your own sanity in the face of the unstoppable. Cyberpunk games appeared and quickly became popular, featuring bands of gun-toting street gangs, rebellion from authority, and of course, hacking. In March of 1990, the Secret Service raided the office of Steve Jackson Games. The reason for that is the upcoming GURPS Cyberpunk game. They seized computers, printers, hundreds of disks, and everything they could, believing that the hacking rules were somehow a how-to manual for computer hacking. When Jackson explained that this was merely science fiction game with dice, one agent replied, "No, this is real." The incident nearly bankrupted the company. 8 employees lost their jobs due to the cutbacks, and it took 3 years to resolve all this in court. Meanwhile, Steve Jackson Games had to rewrite the book from pretty much memory, and then once it was finally released, the book prominently displayed the book that was seized by the U.S. Secret Service. Nice. It's really interesting to see that change in the concerns from the players learning, real magic through these games, all the way up to learning real computer hacking skills, evidently where you download your brain into the computer, but they were really going to learn it from these games. Horror games are also having a rise in popularity as well, but nothing came close to 1991's Vampire the Masquerade. It changed everything. From the gaming side, its push of story first and its mind's eye theater LARP, which was very popular in college campuses and goth clubs. It also influenced how vampires were portrayed in other media, with vampire houses that pulled the strings of government. B.A.D., Underworld, and the Sookie Stackhouse series, aka True Blood, all drew direct inspiration from Vampire the Masquerade. The RPG Moral Panic had tapered out by the mid-1990s, and Vampire had successfully passed under the critics' radar. Then, in January of 1996, police arrested John C. Bush. Bush was 26 and had been discharged from the Navy after being diagnosed with a personality disorder, and he was the leader of a group of 30 to 40 teens in his vampire family, which was very loosely based off of Vampire the Masquerade and Vampire the Eternal Struggle card game. Bush had raped or molested 13 girls between the ages of 13 and 16 as part of his induction that he called the Embrace. Now, the lead detective was a friend of Patricia Pulling, and with Pulling now battling terminal cancer and Thomas Radecki hiding out from media scrutiny at the time, our final RPG villain, Don Rimmer, emerged to lead the charge against vampire gaming. He presented himself as an occult crimes expert and appeared on news and shows, did books and seminars warning of the dangers of Goths and their vampire game. He made quite a career out of it until his death in 2012. Now, about the time of Bush's conviction, November of '96, Rod Farrell, a troubled teen who claimed to be a 400-year-old vampire, was charismatic enough to lead a small clan of teens to run away to New Orleans. Now, while stealing a car, Rod and one of the other teens brutally murdered one of the girl's parents. The case gained national attention, linking it to Farrell's interest in Vampire the Masquerade, which it turns out he really didn't play that much of. Now, 2 months later, two 17-year-olds in Bellevue, Washington, Alex Baragni and David Anderson, murdered a family of 4. Now, during the trial, the media paid special attention to their interest in role-playing games and the fact that they had briefly participated in a vampire LARP. Now, it's worth noting that they'd been kicked out of that LARP. The murders had nothing to do with RPGs, but in the wake of the Vampire Clan murders, it was just too salacious to pass up. But it wasn't always just the media who was tying crimes to role-playing games. In February of 1995, the wife and children of school teacher John Feeney were murdered. Now, Feeney, who had been cheating on his wife and did stand to gain $500,000 in insurance money, was the primary suspect. Unfortunately, the prosecution had no evidence except that Feeney played vampire. No shit, this was the primary argument of the prosecution. Feeney was acquitted, and the case is still unsolved, meaning that either the investigators were so preoccupied with finding a guy who played a role-playing game that they let the trail go cold and the real killer get away, or it means that John Feeney might have actually done the murders and the prosecution just bungled it all up by thinking that role-playing games counted as evidence. So it's official, the vampire prosecution works about as well as the D&D defense. Goth culture and RPGs continued to be demonized throughout the 1990s, and schools cracked down on black nail polish and trench coats as a result, and players had to obfuscate their involvement in the game. That's a Vampire the Masquerade joke. In the immediate aftermath of the 1999 Columbine massacres, everyone was still struggling to comprehend how such a horrible crime had even happened. D&D and Goths were initially blamed, such as this article from the Washington Post. So it's so recent of a tragedy at the time this article came out that the killers' names hadn't been released, and they were still suspect of being graduates. The press knows almost nothing so far, yet that didn't stop them from naming the classic folk devils, Goths, and Dungeons and Dragons. And as more information emerged, eventually the media stopped mentioning tabletop role-playing games. But even naming RPGs in the first place demonstrates just how powerful that belief still was at the time. It felt true, so in lieu of actual facts or information, the narrative that D&D caused deviance and senseless violence, well, that was good enough for them to report at the time. Eventually, like all moral panics, the RPG panic faded close around 2001. A few factors led to this. First, RPGs are no longer new. They'd become more culturally accepted. Also, with the explosive popularity of 2001's Harry Potter and the Lord of the Rings films, fantasy had gone mainstream. 9/11 gave Americans a real enemy to focus on instead of making up shadows to chase. And if we did need a scapegoat, say for any violence that happened domestically, video games had become a perfect new folk devil to count unfounded blame upon. In the years since, D&D has been featured on popular TV shows like Stranger Things, and even shows about playing TTRPGs like Critical Role. Those have become hits as well, and tabletop RPGs have fully hit the mainstream. Yet yet in some tiny circles, the RPG folk devils still remain. Back in 2019, I found this little card stating that belonging starts at church, and that was tucked inside of a Dungeon Master's guide at a local bookstore. So checking some of the other D&D books, I found a second card, which is really nice because it lets me show both sides front and back. They now serve as bookmarks in my copy of Patricia Pulling's The Devil's Web, but the idea that RPGs, especially Dungeons & Dragons, are dangerous or immoral still remain in a limited form, and probably will remain in that form, eventually, for a while until it's just finally forgotten. The first big effect that the moral panic had on RPGs is Dungeons & Dragons had record sales. All the media attention on nightly news and daytime talk shows focusing on D&D ended up being a ton of free advertising for them. Until the panic happened, RPGs were still a really small and niche hobby, and, as they say, bad press is good press. A few years back, my friend Bud Baird had asked me why D&D was just such the dominant RPG in the United States. Well, during the 80s and 90s, RuneQuest is more popular in Great Britain where he was, and I told him that was simple. We had the moral panic, and everyone was talking about Dungeons & Dragons. Even the average person was vaguely aware of the name D&D and what that was, and D&D ended up becoming the term that everybody just used for all role-playing games. In her crusade to destroy Dungeons & Dragons and talking on every TV channel about it, Pat Pulling turned D&D into something like Q-tips or Band-Aids, where the brand has become the name that everyone uses for the product. Now, at the time, D&D did remove the controversial assassins and half-orcs from their second edition release in 1989, while Demons and Devils got their names changed to Tanari and Batazu. Then, by the third edition in 2001, once the panic had cooled, they were quietly brought back in. The RPG moral panic, though, did have some serious negative consequences. Such as people like school teachers who lost their jobs and their reputations. Gary Gygax was hiring bodyguards just due to all the death threats he was receiving. Steve Jackson Games nearly went bankrupt due to the Secret Service raid. And John Feeney, if he was innocent, prosecutors tried to use the fact that he played Vampire the Masquerade as evidence to give him the death penalty. Then, of course, you had people like 16-year-old Ventiquattro who spent time in prison for a full year before they finally threw out his forced confession. Then, of course, the collective trauma of an entire generation of kids who had their books taken away and destroyed by frightened parents. In 1997, the band Marcy Playground released the song Cloak of Elvenkind about a kid hiding his D&D books from his mother, capturing that memory that so many kids from that generation shared. Though until I was working on this video, I had completely forgotten about the band Marcy Playground. It's like I just completely erased that part of my music memory. Now, the larger Satanic Panic had some devastating consequences. The McMartin preschool trial and West Memphis 3 being two cases where innocent people went to jail for years. It absolutely ruined people's lives. Well, hopefully you learned something here. I certainly did while working on this video. I started this project years ago, assembling various articles here and there, but I fully didn't understand the RPG moral panic. The biggest misconception that I had was believing that all of it was tied to the Satanic Panic rather than being a separate but simultaneous thing. And I, of course, learned a whole lot about the Satanic Panic as well. And the more that I read, the deeper and deeper that rabbit hole went, until eventually what I had originally imagined as being a pretty easy, 12 to 15 minute video where I get to talk about the Satanic Panic and make fun of Tom Hanks, ended up blowing up into this. But the big thing that I feel is important when you're looking at moral panics is to understand where they came from. Just how in the hell people got swept up into believing all this horse shit. What cultural concerns were going on at the time in which people were promoting this as fear of whoever it was or whatever it was. Some of these moral entrepreneurs were ignorant. Others were just outright fraudsters, and all boosted by media personalities who were, more interested in having content than actual actual truth. All of us are susceptible to propaganda. I don't care who you are. All of us can and will fall for it in some capacity. And learning how people believe this nonsense is a really great reminder for when we hear outlandish claims that support our own prejudice, just to really step back and look it up and research it. And I'm not talking about, going on YouTube and listening to some talking heads talk about it. And I know I am saying that as a YouTuber talking head right now. Do your own research, because most of the talking heads are really just parroting each other and repeating each other, and nobody knows where this information came from, but these 6 people said it, so therefore, I guess it's credible. One of them had to have looked it up. Don't assume that when it comes to somebody saying things about those prejudices that you already have, even if they're really unbelievable and it sounds great because you don't like whatever it is they're talking about. Look it up, because this is how people get swept up into all these panics. None of us like to admit when we've been duped, not even to ourselves. And once these panics are done, we try to downplay our own involvement or what emotions we felt at the time. Sort of a, wow, I can't believe people went all crazy for that, versus, wow, I can't believe I went all crazy for that. Or people seem to forget about the panic happening altogether. Personally, I had completely forgotten about the super predator scare of the 90s, and most of the people that I talked to about it had also completely forgotten about it. However, at that time, I was the age that the super predator scare was about. I was the one that had to deal with some of the first laws that were coming out in order to control youth, but I had completely forgotten about it until I had read it, and therefore I wasn't able to learn anything from that. So learning to recognize and admit when you were fooled into believing a panic and reflecting on how you allowed that to even happen really is the best way to keep yourself from falling for the next one, because as Mark Twain may or may not have actually said, history rhymes, and there will always be a new panic. Now, for anyone out there wanting to learn more about the RPG moral panic, there are several RPG history books that touch on it, but by far the best, just head and shoulders above the rest of them, is Dangerous Games by Joseph Laycock. This book was absolutely critical in my making this video. I cannot recommend this book enough. It is also available in audiobook if you prefer that, and if this is a subject that interests you, you definitely need to check it out. Till next time, gamers, you have a great day.